this guilty plea deal, agreeing to cooperate, and also as part of this deal, implicating Donald Trump. Essentially, he's admitting that he was coordinating with the Trump campaign to organize fake electors in the state of Georgia and elsewhere, get them together so that there could be an effort to overturn the election or stall the certification, the transfer of power of the presidency in Washington, D.C. in January of 2021. Here is what a prosecutor outlined today as all of the things that Ken Chesebro is agreeing that he did after the 2020 election as part of a felony plea deal.
The defendant created and distributed false electoral college documents to individuals in Georgia and other states in coordination with Donald John Trump for President, Inc., also known as the Trump Campaign. The defendant provided detailed instructions to co-conspirators in Georgia and other states for creating and distributing these false documents. 3, co-conspirator Donald John Trump and John Charles Eastman solicited the director of the Republican National Committee to assist in recruiting persons to serve as fake electors in Georgia as well as in other states. Co-conspirators Rudolph William Louis Giuliani solicited persons to serve as false electors and provided strategic instructions to several co-conspirators concerning the execution of the conspiracy in multiple states. 5, co-conspirator David James Schaefer, Sean Micah Thrasher Steele, and Kathleen Austin Latham and others met at the Georgia State Capitol in Fulton County, Georgia on December the 14th, 2020, created false electoral college documents that falsely stated that the co-conspirator Donald John Trump had received all of Georgia's electoral college votes and delivered those false electoral college documents to Congress and other governmental entities. The co-conspirators also attempted to deliver a copy of the false electoral college documents to the Northern District of Georgia for the purposes of filing, entering, and recording those documents in that court, having reason to know that those documents contain materially false statements that the co-conspirators were the duly elected and qualified presidential electors of the state of Georgia. The defendant was also personally present on the grounds of the United States Capitol during the disruption and delay of the joint session of Congress on January the 6th.
So Boris and Brianna, the headline there is that what Scott Grubman, the attorney for Ken Chesebro, has agreed to as part of this plea deal that Ken Chesebro is admitting to is that he's pleading to one charge, a conspiracy to file false documents in the state of Georgia, those fake electors' certificates. And that conspiracy, part of this charge, that's very important because that means that Ken Chesebro, the attorney who was working with Donald Trump and the campaign, Rudy Giuliani, John Eastman, and others, the other people charged in this case, he's admitting to being part of that group, taking the efforts together. That's quite a significant step forward for not just the district attorney, Fani Willis, but the entire shape of this case. While Chesebro was expected to go to trial today by himself after his co-defendant, Sidney Powell, pleaded guilty yesterday, that trial is not happening, and now this case is left with Donald Trump and several others, including Rudy Giuliani, John Eastman, Mark Meadows, many bold-faced names, other lawyers that were working at that same level as Ken Chesebro, Sidney Powell, and others. They all will now be going to trial at a later date together. So there wasn't going to be now a trial where Ken Chesebro would be trying his case as the only defendant that the jury would be looking at and maybe pointing to Donald Trump or prosecutors having to speak about Donald Trump with Donald Trump not in the room.
Caitlin Polines, thanks so much for the update. Let's get some legal perspective now from former federal prosecutor Renato Mariotti. Renato, thanks for joining us. So here, Kenneth Chesebro essentially acknowledges that he conspired with Donald Trump, John Eastman, Rudy Giuliani, and others. What does that mean for the Fulton County DA's case going forward?
It certainly helps. Look, the way that this was set up, these attorneys were going to have their trial first. I think they went out in front and tried to do that because they recognized that a joint trial with Donald Trump and John Eastman and others, ultimately what was going to happen is Donald Trump and others were going to be pointing fingers at the attorneys and saying, the attorneys put them up to it, the attorneys blessed this and said it was okay. Now, instead of having that dynamic where the defendants are pointing fingers at each other, now the attorneys are going to say, we committed crimes, and these people were part of it. And I think that makes the DA's case stronger, and I also of the other defendants, including some of the other attorneys like Jenna Ellis.
Is he a stronger witness than Sidney Powell?
It's not possible to be a weaker witness than Sidney Powell. I suppose Rudy Giuliani's up there on the weak witness category as well, but Sidney Powell has told so many untruths that I think it's hard to take her seriously. Kenneth Chesebro's a more serious person, although he has some problems himself. After all, he was the one in emails talking about this as a fake electors scheme. And look, anybody who's a convicted felon, anyone who is trying to deal with the government is subject to criticism. But now the DA has two witnesses, and one advantage of I would say, a shotgun approach where you're charging a lot of different people with a lot of different crimes is when you fire a shotgun into a crowd, you're going to hit somebody. And, she's bagged a couple of targets, and more potentially.
And notably, Powell and Chesebro, in their agreements, they have also agreed to testify in future trials, including Jack Smith's federal election subversion case. If you're part of Donald Trump's defense team, none of this is good.
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. I mean, there's certainly a wall that is breaking down for Donald Trump here. And, part of that is an advantage that the DA had in charging attorneys. Attorneys have a lot of downside. It is very challenging. And I think for people in their position, the idea of spending time in a state penitentiary in Georgia is not a particularly appealing proposition. So, they tried an impressive move by seeking an early trial. I do think it had some value for them because I think it encouraged the DA to offer them a deal because she didn't want to preview all of her evidence before, she was going to be going up against Trump at a subsequent trial. But ultimately, at the end of the day, they had to plead guilty to crimes. Kenneth Chesebro, the more serious, plea. Obviously, he pled guilty to plea of felony. But ultimately, at the end of the day, they were, they've ultimately turned to the government team, the prosecution team.
All right, Renato, thank you so much. We do appreciate your insights on a very big news story today. Kenneth Chesebro also taking a plea deal here in the Georgia case.
Yeah, we do want to bring you some breaking news, though, right now. CNN's Alex Marquardt has that for us. Alex, this has to do with the hostages that were being held in Gaza by Hamas.
Yeah, Boris and Brianna, we understand that two of the American hostages who have been held by Hamas are on their way out of the Gaza Strip. We've just learned this from a person who is familiar with the discussions, as well as a diplomatic source who's spoken to my colleague Caitlin Collins. As we know from the Israelis, there have been around 200 hostages who have been held by that militant group, by Hamas, since the horrific attacks inside Israel on October 7th. What we understand from these two sources is that the two Americans are a mother and a daughter. They are currently, we're told, with the Red Cross and heading south in the Gaza Strip. There are two crossings in southern Gaza, one that goes into Egypt, the other that goes into Israel. So right now we're not sure about which country they will be going into. We're also unclear on the identities of this mother and child, but we are told that they are being released on humanitarian grounds. That's according to a source that I spoke with, because the mother is not in good health. Now, Boris and Brianna, this has also been announced by Hamas. A spokesman for the militant group said that the mother and daughter are also being released, they say, on humanitarian grounds, but also because they want to contest the claims being made by Biden and what they call his fascist administration, because they are false and baseless. So we have this mother and daughter, American citizens, who have been held by Hamas for much of the past 2 weeks. Now we understand, with the Red Cross on their way out of Gaza. Guys?
And Alex, to clarify quickly the next steps, is it clear exactly where they're headed next? Is it going to be Egypt or Israel? What do we know?
No, there are two crossings, two gates in the southern part of Gaza. One called Kerem Shalom, which is between Gaza and Israel, and the other one, Rafah, which we've been talking about so much because of the question about aid, and that is where the aid would go from Egypt into Gaza. So right now, it is not clear for us. Certainly, they were abducted in Israel. We know that. So there is, of course, a good chance that they could be then taken back into Israel. But at the same time, it may just be easier for whatever reason, logistics, operationally, security, to have them go into Egypt. But I think one of the important points is now they're with an independent party. They're with the Red Cross. And so that is the best news. They are no longer, we understand, in Hamas custody, although of course Hamas does control the entire Gaza Strip. So this is not a done deal. Things are still obviously extremely fluid, but here we have both our sources outside of Gaza as well as Hamas themselves saying that these 2 Americans are being released.
All right, Alex, I want to bring in Caitlin Collins, who is in Tel Aviv. The 2 of you reported this story out. Caitlin, is there anything, and I don't even know if there's an answer to this at this point, but can we read into anything at this point if they're being released because the mother is in poor health? Could this be an acknowledgement on the part of Hamas that they need to perhaps release people who are not doing well? That they want people who maybe are in good health, that they are going to be using them as pawns as they perhaps later try to utilize them in some kind of prisoner exchange. Can we read into anything at this point?
I think a lot of that remains to be seen. I mean, this was a big question once Hamas had captured so many of these hostages and taken them out into Gaza after that October 7th attack. That was a question, was if they are going to try to use them, as we had seen in the past when Hamas had kidnapped an IDF officer, that there was a lot of negotiation over that. It took years, and in the end, Israel released, I believe there's about 1,000 Palestinian prisoners in exchange for that Israeli officer. And so that was kind of the basis that people were looking at these hostages and the questions over what would happen here. And we've heard Israeli officials say they were not negotiating with Hamas for an exchange for the hostages. But this news is incredibly significant. I mean, these hostages, of course, there's been an open question of what their fate would be, what would happen, especially as we are waiting to see that ground incursion potentially happen. And I can just tell you, we have not heard anything from the Prime Minister's office here in Tel Aviv tonight on the release of these 2 American hostages that Alex and I have reporting on. They have not confirmed it. We are waiting to see what they say about this. We also have not heard from the White House on this front either. But I just want to tell you, this is something that is still every single day here in Tel Aviv, everywhere in Israel. This is something that everyone's talking about. Of course, Shabbat happens on Friday evenings. This is when everyone, their family, their friends get together and have a dinner in the Jewish faith. And earlier we went to this ceremony for all of these families of these hostages, and they had this incredibly long dining table set up with a seat for every person who is believed to have been taken hostage by Hamas and therefore will not be with their families for Shabbat dinner. And it was an incredibly emotional moment. And so just this news in and of itself, that 2 of them have been released, that they are alive, it is something that is going to be hopeful to these families who are waiting for any piece, any scrap of information about their loved ones. And so, of course, the question remains, what happens to the other hostages? What does that look like going forward? I think there are still so many questions for these 2 American hostages that are being released, including where they are going to be released into, whether that's Egypt, whether that's here into Israel. Those are still big questions, and we're still waiting for details over what that looks like, and also, Brianna, as you mentioned, what it could mean for the others and how Hamas plans to use them. One other thing I will say that we talked about last night, and this was in an interview with the New York Times, Hamas leader said that they are not even in control over all the hostages, that there are other terrorist groups, obviously, in Gaza, and they did not have full control over them. Obviously, something that would complicate getting the release of these other hostages.
Caitlin, please stand by. We want to bring in Jim Sciutto now, because, Jim, you just spoke to a longtime hostage representative.
That's right. I spoke to Jonathan Franks, who I'm sure you've spoken with him before. He's been involved, for instance, in the release of the American Trevor Reed from Russia. Also worked on the Travis King case in North Korea. And I asked him what in his experience, a release like this might indicate. He said, given the number of hostages that Hamas is holding, to release 2 could be an attempt just to relieve the pressure somewhat. I mean, you're in the midst of a quite aggressive, devastating Israeli air campaign, threat of a ground offensive, demands for humanitarian supplies. To relieve the pressure does not necessarily portend that all the hostages are going to be freed quickly. He makes the point, and Caitlin made this point as well, that in previous hostage exchanges with Hamas, they've demanded a great deal in return, particularly when it involves a soldier. For instance, Gilad Shalit, 1,000 Palestinian prisoners were released. So it may be, as you look at this, that you have different kinds of hostages. Here's a mother and daughter, apparently the mother in ill health. They can make the case that this is more of a humanitarian case. For soldiers, they might deal differently. For men of military age, they might deal differently as well. But again, Hamas is a group that takes hostages. Hamas is a group that kills civilians. We don't need more evidence of that. A decision like this does not mean Hamas has changed. It means that it sees something, it wants something in return, or it sees this as being in their advantage. And perhaps there was some pressure applied from outside as well.
Yeah, and Alex, I understand you have some information about how this negotiation went down.
Well, Jim's absolutely right in terms of the pressure being applied from outside. Hamas is considered a terrorist organization, of course, by not just Israel, but the United States as well. And that means that those two countries don't have direct dialogue with Hamas. So in this situation, and this has been the case for much of the past 2 weeks since these 200 or so people were taken, is that it was primarily Qatar that was engaging with Hamas. They're the main conduit for Israel and the U.S. to talk to that militant group. Qatar has several Hamas leaders who live in their capital in Doha. So this really has been the portfolio that the U.S. has asked Qatar to undertake. When Secretary Antony Blinken was crisscrossing the region, going to all these different Middle Eastern countries, he very quickly went to Qatar, and that was because they have this direct line into Hamas. And so here this is, both according to the sources that we have spoken with, but also Hamas themselves, the result of this negotiation between Hamas and Qatar. But no doubt the presence of these still around 200 hostages who will still be in the custody of Hamas and other groups, we understand, or subgroups all across the Gaza Strip, that is going to wildly complicate the efforts of the Israeli military, who of course we believe are going to go into Gaza on the ground any day now. We've been talking about this sprawling network of tunnels throughout the Gaza Strip. We understand that the hostages may be in those tunnels, maybe in the bunkers. And so
2 U.S. hostages, a mother and a daughter, being released by Hamas. So it's a bit complicated, as you just heard. Hostages being released. The mother is in ill health.
Saying that these hostages are being held by different groups. It's also difficult to get a read on just how many hostages there are, not only because of that, but according to this spokesperson, because of continued bombing in Gaza. So does Israeli intelligence, does U.S. intelligence have an actual number? Do they know how many hostages there are still that are still being held captive, and how many Americans specifically?
Well, unlike with the death toll that we have sadly seen grow over the course of the past 2 weeks, the number of hostages has fluctuated. That too has grown, and essentially, Boris and Brianna, this is a process of deduction. The Israelis and other countries who have citizens who have been missing, they have been able to figure out who has been killed, who has surfaced, thankfully, and then who are still missing. And so they have been able to narrow that number down, but haven't put a specific point on it. It is hovering, we understand, around 200. We should also make the point that not only are these hostages, we believe, spread out between Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, which is another Iranian-backed allied group, but different groups within Hamas is the belief. So that makes things extremely complicated. On the humanitarian front, and this humanitarian excuse or reason that Hamas is giving for releasing these 2 Americans, keep in mind, guys, that it is extremely difficult for militant groups, for anyone really, to have 200 prisoners. You have to keep them safe. If you plan to use them as leverage, you need to keep them fed. It is a big lift. So if indeed this American mother is not doing well, it is certainly a burden for Hamas and perhaps in their interest to allow these 2 Americans leave and to hand them back over. But to Caitlin's earlier point, no doubt the Hamas is going to try to use these prisoners as leverage, whether it's to release the hundreds of Palestinians who are in Israeli prisons, whether it's to get more aid into the country, whether it's to call for a ceasefire. These are all things that we've heard considered. Certainly, Hamas is going to try to use them for their benefit.
Yeah, and Jim, I mean, if the mother is reportedly here in poor health, let's just consider the state of hospitals right now in Gaza, the state of medical care. It is awful.
Well, even the worst hostage takers, and let's put Hamas into that category, see the risks of having an American die on their hands, particularly if it's not, say, from a strike, right? You know, given the hostages are distributed around Gaza right now, but dies in their hands in ill health. So they would see the benefit again to them, and let's look at it through that prism of releasing them because they just have less value, right? And we've seen some precedent for that, for instance, in Iran, when Americans held in Iran had health issues, it made it more likely for them to be released, oftentimes still for something in return, but that Iran knew they didn't want to have an American dying on their hands because they might face bigger consequences. So it's not getting to their morality or their sense of altruism for that hostage, but more a calculation that, wait a second, we may pay a heavy price for this if this American mother dies in our hands.